Hey everyone, it's Veroosh. This is your reading for the December 3rd eclipse that is happening tonight. Unfortunately, I got sick with a migraine today, so I'm only going to do an overview, but this eclipse is an important one and there are some very interesting aspects on it that I want to tell you about. And so we're going to do this video in like a shorter form and then get back to regular programming finally, so thanks for waiting for that. I've been away finishing something that's been outstanding for a long time. It came to a point where I just had to sit down and do it, and everything was distracting me because it was a hard thing to do for me, so I'm very glad to say that it's finished now, and I've been back doing consultations and catching up, so you'll be hearing more from me soon, and it's nice to be back. But no drama on my side besides just getting tired and needing to catch up. So I hope you guys are well too. So tonight there's an eclipse happening. It's a solar eclipse in Sagittarius. And this is a very important eclipse because it is the last eclipse of the axis of the North Node in Gemini, South Node in Sagittarius transit that begun in May 2020. In a couple weeks, the nodes are going to be switching into Scorpio and Taurus, and we'll definitely do videos regarding that. But this eclipse is the last eclipse in Gemini or Sagittarius for the next 9 years. So if you don't know, eclipses happen alongside the nodal axis. The nodal axis is the North Node in Gemini, South Node in Sagittarius, soon to be North Node in Taurus, and South Node in Scorpio. And so as the nodes are in particular signs, then we have eclipses alongside them. So we've already seen the first eclipse for the Taurus node, the North Node in Taurus. It was a full moon a couple weeks ago, which began certain things certain energy frequencies that I'll talk about later when we talk about the nodal shift, but they're quite distinct and I'm actually observing them already. If you want to know more, then just hop back in my video. I'll link it in the corner in which I talk about that eclipse. You might gain benefit from watching that video retroactively as well. Even though eclipse happened, it's really a video or a reading that explains what's begun, and it's something to kind of keep in mind because it's the starting point of that Taurus Scorpio energy. And so the Sagittarian eclipse, which is a new moon eclipse, it's the new moon in Sagittarius, is actually finishing up the cycle of the last year and a half. So if you want to get familiar with the energy, and I really encourage trying to be able to feel it and perceive it for yourself, take a look at the last year and a half and see if you can see some of these frequencies with regard to the North Node in Gemini, South Node in Sagittarius. One thing that I pointed out on Twitter, I did write up something on Twitter earlier, so if you guys don't hear from me, Twitter's a good place to check in to see if I have something to say. And on Twitter, I can be more candid sometimes with certain things because I can just write it out and whoever wants to read it can read it. But I pointed out that the whole sickness, the global sickness that has happened, has not happened necessarily in the North Node in Gemini, South Node in Sagittarius axis. It actually happened when the North Node was in Cancer and the South Node was in Capricorn. That's when it started. But what's happened during the North Node in Gemini, South Node in Sagittarius axis is largely our response to this crisis. And I think that there's a very particular vibe that we've all experienced in the last year and a half. Maybe you've seen that in your personal life. I'm seeing it more globally, but maybe you are seeing it in your own personal life as well. And what I'm actually seeing is a lot of fast decisions being made, And without getting too political, I feel as though that there has been a lot of quick choices and a lot of decisions that were not decided upon by consensus. So nobody voted for them, there was no checking back in with the public. There was just, this is what we're doing in these ways, and bam. Now we understand that it's a crisis, and so to a certain extent it had to happen that way, but some of the things that happened were large social changes, economic changes that we were never asked about. And I feel like there's been a lot of narrative pushing. And again, I'm not being political. This comes to criticize both sides of the spectrum of politics. But there's been a lot of narrative pushing based on ideology, right? And I don't think anybody's actually gotten it fully right. So there's been this 18-year-and-a-half period, North Node in Gemini, in which there was an agenda and there wasn't too much room to talk back or ask questions. And I think that that's coming to an end with this eclipse. So maybe some of you are wondering what the solar eclipse is. So a solar eclipse is a new moon eclipse, and this is when the Earth obscures all the light from the sun onto the moon. So the moon becomes very dim. And sometimes there's a partial eclipse, sometimes there's a full eclipse. Right now we're seeing a full eclipse, but it's going to be very brief, only a few minutes. Now there are going to be several places in the world in which there's like partial eclipse for a little bit longer, for several hours, but the high point of the eclipse is not going to be seen for very long. It's actually going to be happening tonight at 11:30 p.m. Pacific, and it's only going to be really seen in South America. No, it's going to be seen in the Antarctic, the South Pole. It is going to be seen also in places like the very tip of Australia, in Tasmania, and South Africa, a southern tip of the southern island of New Zealand as well. But the people who will be able to see this eclipse are the people in Antarctica, so hopefully they'll provide us with some wonderful clips. Now, if you're wondering about the time, so I said 11:30 p.m. Pacific time, so that's going to be about 2:30 a.m. December 4th Eastern time. And it's going to be later in the day on the 4th of December for the rest of the world. But again, none of us are going to be seeing it unless you are in those southern tips of the world. And we'll explain more about that in just a minute. Another way to really understand this eclipse is the fact that the sun and the moon are eclipsing the south node, not the north node. And the south node of the moon has to do with regenerative cycles, with past lives, release of old karma, and the past. I'll explain that more in a second, because it's true that there are several different historical interpretations of the South Node, and especially considering those is important at this time. But suffice it to say that the great harmony of this switch between Sagittarius and Scorpio is that of that closing cycle of the Gemini-Sagittarius axis. And so I think that the fact that the last eclipse of that axis is happening alongside the South Node is quite poignant. So something's closing out instead of looking forward with the North Node. We're referencing to the past and closing out these old cycles and energies. You can think about this in terms of something like Kundalini energy, where the snake is sort of rising from the bottom to top. This is quite different than other traditions like the Kabbalistic tradition, which is actually the opposite direction. I always thought that was kind of interesting, that the Kundalini design goes up, while the Kabbalistic traditions, the energy is coming down. But I digress, it's just a little nerdy sidebar. But when you're thinking about this, and I want to think about this in terms of the North Node and the South Node, in terms of a dragon's head and a dragon's tail, the North Node being the head and the South Node being the tail of the traditional interpretation of the nodes. You can visualize the eclipse alongside the South Pole, of the Earth. And with this new moon alongside the tail, opening something up to bring into conclusion some kind of phase that has happened for us in the world. And I think that's kind of interesting when we think about the last year and a half and some of the major ideas that have been popularized in the world. For one, there's been a lot of talk of the Great Reset, right? So we've heard all about this. And the Great Reset is about a huge readjustment of the social order, about taking a pause and redirecting how our world is run. And again, I'm not making a political statement beyond just saying that this has been a factor that we've been talking about. But another important reset happened, if you remember back to December 2020. In December of 2020, we had the Great Conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn. And this happened on the winter solstice in the sign of Aquarius. And it marked a 200-year cyclical change into conjunctions between the two planets from earth signs into air signs. So we've had a lot of talk about the age of Aquarius and just this pattern shift and change. So you see the South Node eclipse happening as the last kind of big event of this period of a year and a half, in which there's been a lot of signaling of a massive reset, new patterns, a shift in direction. So I think that we've been in this transitory period of dealing with this global crisis, seeing the first responses to it, and now I feel like we'll be settling into this new direction of how we will actually be dealing with it as the North Node moves into Taurus. It's going to be very, very significant, and if you don't know much about astrology, I think you will recognize the pattern quite easily. So some things in astrology are very easy to notice, other things are more subtle, but this is going to be, you're going to look around and say, wow, the world's changing. So what I'm seeing is this first response with the North Node in Gemini, South Node in Sagittarius axis. A lot of decisions being made very quickly. Maybe not everything even legitimized by a democratic process, just decisions were made because it was an emergency. And we've had two big signals, one from current events, the Great Reset, which was a giant movement that rose up in the last year and a half, and the second, astrologically speaking, there's been that change between Jupiter and Saturn joining in Aquarius from here on in for the next 200 years. Now, one thing about eclipses that people should know is that eclipses, where they physically happen, so where you are able to see the event happening, either the sun obscured or the moon, that is said to be the place where things are going on. Now, this is ancient astrology. I believe that eclipses affect all of us, but I do believe that being underneath the rays of an eclipse is somewhat significant or special. So because this eclipse is happening and just touching the southern tip of Africa, South Africa specifically, I just want to mention that jumping to conclusions that this new variant of the disease is somehow connected to this eclipse is a little bit preemptive, too quick, too fast. Specifically, there's been a lot of reports that This variant is not from South Africa, and the only reason it's been detected there is because they have such good quality research capabilities and they have very advanced testing. So if you hear someone saying that the South Node eclipse is happening in South Africa and feeding this new variant, I would just be very skeptical when hearing that. I think another thing we've learned is that finger pointing in a situation like this can be very ineffective or unpragmatic, not actually achieving any meaningful result. So thanks, South Africa, for detecting this. I'm sure you saved a lot of lives by doing so. So this eclipse, astrologically speaking, let's talk about the astrology. This eclipse is in the sign of Sagittarius at 12 degrees, and Sagittarius is ruled by the planet Jupiter, so that's very significant for this eclipse to consider. Jupiter is currently in Aquarius, and it is squaring the nodes. It's important to note that the eclipse is happening at 12 degrees of Sagittarius, while the nodes are currently at 1 degree, 2 degree, depending on which node you're using. So the eclipse is not, Jupiter is not on a square to the new moon, but it is squaring the nodes, which is significant. And also it is squaring Mars in Scorpio. So I feel like there is some tension between positive movement forward at this time. I feel like there may be some hesitancy and holding back to step forward because of this square. This may happen in your personal life, or it may feel like a global comment. In fact, I feel a lot of this video has to do with global issues, but maybe you'll find some truth in the messages here for yourself personally as well. So there's a stubbornness there as Jupiter squares the north and the south node, and also squares Mars, the planet of action in Scorpio. And just today there was a lot of pushback in the markets, in the financial markets, as this new variant data has come out. Also, the crypto markets have been hit very hard because there's been a lot of talk about regulation. And again, you guys know my kind of opinion about guessing crypto with astrology. I feel like technical analysis and understanding what you're essentially buying on a technical level is better than guessing with stars or graphs and so forth. But as a comprehensive overview, I think that there is something to be said about this square between Jupiter, the nodes, and Mars. I think that there's some tension that can also illustrate for us the energy in our personal lives moving forward. We may want to push forward, go ahead, and yet there's some grit there. There's not so much fluid energy. So let's talk about the Decans or the Decans. I know why I call it Decan now, which is funny. It took me a while to figure out. There's a great musician called Dan Decan. If you guys don't know, then go check him out. And I used to listen to him a lot. And I still picked up and I found his music again. And I was like, oh, Decan, that's why it kind of got me to say it that way. But anyway, people say it multiple different ways, and I think it's fine. But let's talk about the decans of this eclipse, which is, this eclipse is happening in the second decan of Sagittarius. And so this decan is actually ruled by the moon, where the new moon is. That's wonderful. And so the new moon itself is forming a syzygy between a Mercury and the Earth and the moon and the sun. I think Vesta is also there. I mean, that's a pretty wide orb, but it is a bit of a stellium. So there's a lot of concentrated energy pushing this new moon along. I would really see this as like the final stage, the closing chapter of the last year and a half, as I said. And there's a nice sextile on Saturn in Aquarius, which I actually really like for this placement. I feel like the sextile with Saturn is allowing us to finish things up in the right way. So even if there's some kinds of changes that are overwhelming or a shift in the markets, as I said, Saturn's attention for detail helps us recognize and figure out exactly what's going on and what needs to be addressed, and hopefully gives us the gumption to actually close that chapter in our lives so we can carry on and address things. And I talked about this more on Twitter in terms of recognizing what's going on. I think I articulated it better on Twitter, so go check that out. It's just 2 posts I made earlier today. Now, the modern ruler of the second decan is Mars. And as we already identified, Mars is at the end of Scorpio and creating a square to Jupiter. So there's tension between Mars and Jupiter in connection to the nodes, which are sort of our trajectory, right? So that's less positive in terms of feeling like we can push ahead. We may feel like there's tension, like good luck's kind of a far-fetch, like we have to put in all the effort ourselves at this time. But the silver lining is that this is not a long-term transit, and I feel as though it's going to get much better in the upcoming days as the square gets more gentle. Now, Mars is at a sextile to Venus, and that's important to consider as well, because Venus is about to enter the Venus retrograde cycle, and we'll do videos about this as well. But Mars and Venus have been going back and forth since the summer, so there's been a closening, there was a square, and now there is a sextile. I don't know if you guys have watched me a lot or not, so let me just tell you right here, I really like my sextiles. And this sextile, because it's preceding Venus retrograde in the sign of Capricorn, is telling me that there is some kind of love business that you may be finishing up. Pay attention to this time in terms of love and relationships, because whatever is coming up may actually be a prelude to the Capricorn retrograde of Venus. So it's a little bit of a heart picker upper energy, a little bit of motivation. I could see people acting on their desires a bit more, being a bit more assertive, and I can't encourage you more to do so. We'll talk more about the Venus retrograde cycle in a few days. But for the time being, if your heart's going after something, I think you should explore that at this time. Mars is also sextile to Pluto, which again is adding to tension and frustrations. I think sextile between Pluto and Mars may indicate a more of a reactive energy. So this might affect the markets, people reacting and acting on fears of the unknown, but also more assertiveness out there, and that might affect you in your personal life as well. So if you want to be assertive, if your instincts are pulling you a certain direction, this transit might be affecting you to that effect. But also, if you are wary of reactive energy, then you might want to be aware that's with us at this time as well. Okay, so this is a little sidebar about the Pluto return of the United States. I need to touch upon this because several of you have asked for me to talk about the return. If you don't know, Pluto is returning to the position at which the America signed its Declaration of Independence. Don't shoot me, I'm Canadian. So there's a return of Pluto back to the original position of when that happened. And people use that as the marking point for the creation of America. A lot of people have pointed out that this is going to be a turning point for America. And I don't know if I agree with that overall. I do think that a Pluto return is significant. But this eclipse is actually tied into that energy as well, as the ascending sign for the signing of the Declaration of Independence is 12 degrees of Sagittarius. I kid you not. So unless if you don't know enough astrology or if you missed that point, this is where this eclipse is happening, precisely. Now, you haven't heard me talk much about this. Feel free to tell me in the comments if you want to hear more. Frankly, I'm a bit hesitant to talk about it, and I don't frankly like the way it's being talked about. It's very American-centric without considering factors outside of the US. I feel as though the perspectives that are being shared about this are very narrow without considering larger geopolitical influences. Again, I put a more detailed explanation of my opinion on Twitter if you guys want to know more. But for the purpose of talking about the Pluto return alongside the eclipse today, I just believe overall, and this is what my perspective is that America's geopolitical position, this is beyond within America, also outside of America, is changing. And it's not only changing because of what's happening in America. I do believe that this eclipse alongside the Pluto return will change America, and I'm really hopeful it's for the better. And my opinion, if you want to know, is I cannot encourage Americans to be kind to each other and focus on national unity instead of feeding into divisiveness at this time. It's my opinion that there are other factors at play that are causing a lot of instability. And so working together to make America better is important for everyone. So I wish you guys good luck with that. And like I said, I'm Canadian, so I'll stop right there with that kind of logic or opinion making. But if you want to know more detail, go on Twitter, ask me down in the comments if you want a dedicated video on that. But like I said on Twitter, if you guys actually hear my opinion on what's going on, you may not like it. Not in the sense that it's highly political in one direction or the next. I am nonpartisan, fiercely independent. But I do feel as though some of the dominant narratives about what's going on for America, well, I just don't jive with them. I think that there's different ways of looking at that. And I hope this eclipse illuminates maybe some of the things I'm seeing to help you guys do better and position yourselves better. So I wish you guys all the best. One thing I will say is for Canada and America, one of the core important things is education. And so whenever we're talking about social matters and social fabric and so forth, I think first and foremost we have to start with good education in elementary going up to university, and it should be accessible to everybody. Okay, so I love America, just so you know, so it's hard to talk about without being overly passionate. Okay, so let's go back to this 12 degrees of Sagittarius. So we have the eclipse at 12 degrees. It's on the ascendant of the American chart for the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And there's a fixed star there. That's very important that I've been tiptoeing around. I alluded to it earlier when talking about Kundalini, but let's talk about it here. I wanted to kind of find a specific place to explain it to you. So there's a fixed star called Rastaban, which is Draco beta star. So Draco is the dragon of the northern hemisphere, and so this eclipse is happening alongside this star. Now I've also heard some people talk about different stars and different things, different asteroids, but because we're already at 30 minutes, I think that this is the one to focus on. The other stars also have a wider orb, so they are not necessarily within a tight orb of the eclipse, and for the eclipse I would like to use a tighter orb. I typically, for stars and asteroids, only use one and something degree orb unless there's a very specific reason to make it bigger. But I think this fixed star called Rastaban is very important. And guess what Rastaban means in Arabic? Now, some of you guys speak Arabic, so maybe you can details down below, but I'm going to tell you guys now. It's actually the head of the dragon. Isn't that interesting? So if you know a little bit of astrology, you know that the North Node is the head of the dragon. Hey girl, hey. So now it's starting to give us little shivers and goosebumps, I hope. Yes, you're seeing the pattern. There's something very significant here. And I don't want to be into wild theories, so I want to present you with the facts, and maybe you can identify your own patterns and the things that you're seeing. Now, the Draco constellation, now I'm saying it right. The Draco constellation is one of the oldest constellations. So when the 12 original constellations were put together or identified, there were 2 other constellations alongside the 12 zodiac constellations, one of them being Draco, the dragon. And Draco consists of something like 80 stars, I believe. And it literally means a dragon, and there is a lot of historical traditions that it touches upon, including Babylonian Tiamat tradition, the Chinese tradition, Egyptian with the alligator or crocodile, and the Greek tradition have focus on this constellation. Maybe we can talk about this more separately, but for tonight, this is just enough information. So this constellation called the Dragon has this star called Rastaban, which is its beta star. Beta star means it's the second star in its categorical system. So each constellation starts with an alpha, beta, gamma, etc. And so this star is called the head. Sometimes it's identified as the eye, but that's somewhat incorrect. It's actually the top of the head of the dragon. And of course, we can see the parallel with the North Node and South Node, the head and the tail of the dragon of the lunar nodes. So let me tie it up for you a little bit here. So we see an eclipse alongside the South Node of Sagittarius, that is happening at 12 degrees of Sagittarius alongside the ascendant of the United States. So an eclipse at the tail of the nodal axis, right, in terms of the nodal astrology, with the star of the head of the dragon Draco in that same position. So what does that remind you of? Because I have immediately a vision of the Ouroboros, which is the snake that's eating its own tail. So to me, in terms of symbology, this moment does represent some kind of turning of the tide, some big transition, and I do think it's a big one. Maybe on a personal level you'll experience one, but I feel as though this is a turning of the tide. There is a shift here. And I'm excited to tell you about the North Node in Taurus and the South Node in Scorpio, because I feel like this is going to be leading directly into this. But the symbology of the dragon, Draco, and the dragon of the nodes, the lunar nodes, it's a beautiful synastry, right? It's a beautiful compilation. Now the star Rastaban is tied to property. So we've already talked about crypto and legacy markets a little bit. And we know in the last year and a half, there has been extensive efforts on behalf of governments to synthetically stimulate the economy. I'm not getting political, I'm just telling you the facts. And so I feel as though there's going to be a fundamental change with regard to this at this time. Because I feel like with the new variant that's come out, sustaining those types of efforts becomes too much of a strain. And even though that seems really scary, let me tell you why I think it's a good thing. I think it's a good thing because too much manipulation, too much synthetic involvement may in some way worsen the end result for everyone. And so sometimes cutting your losses and accepting the reality as it is better than continually running and trying to keep it going at a detriment for long-term consequences. So I think it's a good thing. So don't worry. I don't think any of this is bad. I think these are necessary shifts and transitions, and I would actually think of them as neutral rather than positive or negative. So before we finish up, this is the last thing. Let me tell you about Draco, because there's so much to say, but here's something cool because it's happening tonight. So between 4500 BCE and 2000 BCE, the stars of Draco comprise the pole star. That's the star that is at the poles that appears not to move as it's directly north of the pole. And the pole star changes because of the precession of the equinoxes through the Earth's tilt. So as the tilt happens, then these pole stars change over hundreds of years, if not thousands. But at some point, this dragon, Draco, was the constellation that was at the top of the northern hemisphere heavens or sky, right? So when people looked up, there was this dragon that would circle around, and different stars of it were the pole star. And about 2500 BCE, Draco Alpha, which is the first star, was the pole star. And so when people would look up, Draco would never set on the horizon because it was always at the pole. So it was always right above us in the northern hemisphere. And so it appeared as though there was this giant dragon in the sky. And so as time moved on and the pole stars shifted, the dragon constellation, sort of positioned itself a little bit lower, and it started kind of moving around the sky, but still not setting. And that reminds me of all the European mythology of dragons hoarding gold. Sorry, I messed up the story a little bit, but let me tell you. So there, in Europe, there's been a lot of mythology around, dragons hoarding gold and kind of being in a lair. And so to the ancients, this constellation Draco would appear to always be up in the sky, circling around, and the stars in its constellation, all the different stars, they would describe as what they were hoarding. So there was this dragon in the sky that the ancients observed that they perceived as hoarding. And I wonder if that did not influence European mythology, and that's the dragon they're talking about. It's also associated with the feminine, so that's interesting to consider. So there's a protective energy with regard to that. So I thought that was a nice place to end. As a woman, I feel very protective over you guys, and so I hope you enjoy this. I think this is a good closure. It's a understanding of things, and I feel as though this closure is also bringing us awareness of things we need to understand and know about. So embrace the new information coming your way and be excited about the new phase, and I hope that it's going to be a bright one. Have a happy new moon eclipse, and I'll be back with regular videos within a couple days. Talk to you soon. Thank you. Bye.